My article today is about Utah, God's country. GOP Senator, this is from Marijuana Moment. Ben wrote another one. Thank you, Senor Adlin, for your byline here. GOP Senator is wrong about international treaties preventing marijuana rescheduling, cannabis companies and advocacy organizations say. Dozens of marijuana companies and advocacy groups are pushing back against Senator Mitt Romney, Utah's recent claims that the U.S. would be in violation of international drug treaty agreements if it rescheduled cannabis to Schedule III of the Controlled Substance Act. In a letter sent to Romney this month, more than 50 organizations said the senator made, quote, inaccurate claims that neither reflect the current state of medical and scientific knowledge about marijuana nor an accurate application of relevant treaties to proposed reforms, unquote. Signatories, including major marijuana businesses, industry groups, law firms, ancillary businesses, and cannabis advocacy organizations said in an April 9th letter that they wanted to correct the record. Late last month, Romney and Senator James Risch R. Indiana and Pete Ricketts are sent in a letter to the Drug Enforcement Administration Administrator Ann Kilogram, arguing that the rescheduling marijuana, as recommended by the Department of Health and Human Services, will put the U.S. out of compliance with international treaty obligations and make it harder to ensure that other countries continue to enforce drug laws, including the deadly narcotics like fentanyl. The news industry and advocacy group responses contend that Romney's understanding of the law is out of date. Your letter cites a 1977 decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit describing obligations under the single convention that would not be met if marijuana were reclassified under Schedule III, it says. However, in the many years since the court weighed in, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to reclassify cannabis in recognition of its medical uses. Moving marijuana to Schedule III, as recommended by the HHS, simply acknowledges this accepted reality. The U.S. is not under any applicable treaty to keep marijuana in Schedule I or II under the CSA. So long as certain requirements are met, the drug treaties provide the U.S. with the flexibility to classify relevant substances based on scientific and medical evidence and in accordance with domestic laws such as the CSA. The U.S. Department of State addressed this in the fall of 2023 during an intersessional meeting of the UN's Commission on Narcotic Drugs, stating that the single convention is primarily focused on drug trafficking and has an international rather than domestic focus. Ever since news leaked in August that the Department of Health and Human Services had sent a recommendation to the DEA that marijuana would be rescheduled as a Schedule III drug, some have warned that the move could still hit legal snags. One of the open questions is whether the U.S. interpretation of international drug law would block the proposal. Officials and advocates have interpreted the country's duties under those treaties in competing ways. Among those who've raised concern is Representative Andy Harris, Maryland, who raised the issue in a letter to the DEA Administrator Milligram in January, claiming that any reclassification that puts marijuana outside of Schedule I or II would, quote, constitute a violation of the Single Convention, referring to the 1961 United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. In 2016, the DEA said in a denial of cannabis rescheduling petition that, in the view of the United States obligations under international drug control treaties, marijuana could not be placed in a schedule less restrictive than Schedule II. But a coalition of 12 senators pointed out in a separate letter to Milligram a week before this other letter was sent that the UN has since revised global cannabis scheduling policies and allowed other member states, such as Canada, to legalize and regulate marijuana without penalty. Those lawmakers urged the DEA to legalize marijuana completely. Earlier this month, meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his government's concern about possible UN penalties for legalizing marijuana never materialized, disclosing that no officials have so much as discussed the issue with Canada since the reform was acted in 2018. The Prime Minister was a chief proponent of legalization, and the government has defended its decision to advance the reform, including at a meeting of the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 2020. In February, a group of lawyers specializing in cannabis argued in a legal opinion that international drug treaties ought not stand in the way of moving marijuana to Schedule III. In fact, it said a move to Schedule III would better uphold the country's broader obligations under international law to regulate cannabis in a way that protects public health and safety. The new letter to Romney echoes many of of that opinion's arguments. The current placement of marijuana under Schedule 1 prevents the U.S. from ensuring the substance availability for medical and scientific research as required by the single convention, it says. Reclassification under Schedule 3 would therefore bring the U.S. closer to compliance with the treaty requirements. Meanwhile, the HHS has reportedly requested a legal opinion on the implications of possible marijuana rescheduling from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, and some suspect it concerns the potential international treaty consequences. Representative Earl Blumenauer, D. Oregon, has requested clarification on the request from the HHS. A Democratic Congresswoman has separately implored DEA to reject any argument that rescheduling marijuana under federal law would constitute a violation of international treaty obligations. She also asked the agency to reveal a list of any outside partners it has met with to discuss the global implications of a potential cannabis reclassification. The UN International Narcotics Control Board did recently reiterate that it considers legalizing marijuana for non-medical or non-scientific purposes a violation of international treaties. Here's a list of the groups that signed the letter to Romney, as well as a copy of the letter itself. Acreage Holdings, Ascend Wellness, Asian Americans for Cannabis Education, American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, Ire Wellness, Bada Bloom, Balanced Veterans Network, Cannabis Company, Conbud, shout out to New York, Cresco Labs, Dutchie, didn't have a good POS day on 420,
yeah,
so
they
sorry.
crashed.
Yeah, that would have been my article. But anyway, Good Day Farms, Green Thumb Industries, Hemp for Victory, Hero Grown, Holistic Solutions, Holistic Industries, Housing Work, IVA, Jushi, Justice Foundation. Shout out. They're awesome. Thank you. Kush Culture Industries, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, Loom Cannabis, Major Bloom, Majority Minority Group, Mark Enterprises, Marijuana Policy Project, Moody Day, National Cannabis Roundtable, National Hispanic Cannabis Council, Native Roots Dispensary, New York Card Coalition, Jason, what's up? New York for Social Equity and Economic Equity, Perkins Coal, PharmaCann, Phylos Bio, Physicians Research Center, Porter Wright, PPP Dispensary, Quality Roots, Queen City Remedies, Realm for Caring, Santa Cruz, NorCal, thank you, Veterans Alliance, Scott's Miracle Grow, hey, good for you all, Simply Pure Trenton, Tetragram, the Bronx Community Foundation, the Travel Agency, the Weldon Project, True Leaf, Tortura Capital, United States Cannabis Council, Valley Wellness. I mean, it's like a whole article just to go through the names of people who signed this. Verano Holdings, Vincente, hey, shout out to my lawyers. Juana Brands, Nancy, congratulations. Wild Veterans Cannabis Project. So let me kick off my opinion before I hand this back to my other esteemed guests and panelists to hear what they think and what they have to say. The United States has an oversized influence on what happens at the UN, not just because of how much money it contributes, not just because of where the UN offices are located, because at the end of the day, the United States gives no fucks and does whatever it wants to do. If that was a problem, we wouldn't have black sites and rendition and waterboarding during the last Persian Gulf War, right? Like the Iraq War. We did whatever we wanted. UN conventions, articles, Geneva Conventions, whatever. We're going to just kidnap some people from their country, do illegal renditions. The United States, under Obama, assassinated an American citizen with a drone strike in absentia on foreign soil. This is not a Republican or Democratic thing. The United States does what it wants to do. So if Canada, our maple syrup neighbors to the north, aren't having problems with this and are stating as much, why is it that we think that this rationalization that we have to be in compliance with something when most of the time we set the goalpost ourselves would ever be a reason why we wouldn't have a bit more coherent federal policy that allows the patchwork of state policies to not be incongruent with federal policy and not be a source of consternation when it comes to our compliance with international treaties and laws. This is Yarrow Kubrin, High at 9 News. I'd like to know what y'all think.
Well, Yarrow, I mean, I happen to agree with them is that America's going to do what it wants to do, and I don't think that this treaty argument is enough to stall or give a reason to not move it. But I still don't want it to go to Schedule 3. But nonetheless, I personally agree with this article.
Well, the UN the council that controls drug scheduling moved cannabis off of Schedule 1 at the UN level. So they're already moving at the UN in the right direction. The fact that they never have said boo to Canada that federally legalized for adult use is information. And I can tell you this, that piece of information was a huge turning point in the German legalization movement, because when Germany was using the UN treaty as part of the reason that they weren't going to legalize and they were pushing things back, that's when Trudeau stepped up and said, hey, we haven't had any problems. And then the German government was like, all right, look, we need that money. I mean, that's really what it boiled down to. The interesting thing for me about the Germans on that argument was, it wasn't just that they were going after tax dollar. This is the argument that I found really profound. They are talking about harm reduction and the financial implications of harm reduction caused by the war on drugs, specifically the amount of money they spend on police, but more so the amount of money that they spend. Remember, it's a socialist government with socialized medicine. The amount of money that they spend on therapy and programs for the traumatized children of people who've gone to jail. So they're talking about the societal harm reduction savings, and they are attributing that to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 billion. So the Romney attempt to try to scare everybody, oh, the UN, it's just more scare tactics, or it's a litmus test, just to get people talking about it like we are now. I don't believe it for 1 second. Utah has a thriving medical marijuana program, and Romney himself is seeing the benefits of that legalization in his state. So I can't imagine he's doing anything other than a political litmus test.
I would agree with that. It's just he's just throwing stuff out there to see what sticks, see who it resonates with and whatnot. Just I could agree with that 100%.
I think there's a world in which Utah has some of the worst issues with opioids and the risk that has created, the impact that has created on their younger generations. I think there's some data that suggests that access to regulated cannabis reduces use of other substances, including alcohol. And so, in addition to the public benefits that Jamie talked about, there could be a harm reduction component to increasing the availability of laboratory tested, safe, supply chain regulated, age restricted cannabis in Utah.
Amen.